Your house is probably your most valuable asset. Of course, when it comes to selling it, you'll want to get the best possible price. So good presentation of your property is essential. But many vendors fail to get the asking price. Of sales that fall through, 43% of them are because of adverse surveys and valuations. So it's not just the buyers that you need to impress. Upon instruction from your mortgage lender or buyer, a surveyor will undertake a survey or valuation of your home and report back on its condition. So a favourable survey can help maximise the value of your property and smooth the way to a satisfactory completion. So what's the surveyor looking for, and what can you do to help get that all-important asking price? Well, this property health check video has been created to answer all those questions, and our expert guide is Chartered Surveyor Richard Hocking. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Gemma.
You've been doing this job for 25 years. You've looked over some 17,000 residential homes. Tell us, what are the main things that you're looking for?
As a surveyor, when I first turn up at your home, if I'm doing a detailed inspection for a purchaser, I'm going to be doing a detailed inspection of the exterior, the interior and the services. If I'm doing evaluation for mortgage purposes for a lender, I'll similarly be undertaking an inspection, but it won't be quite to the same extent of detail. In both cases, I'll be making sure that the external envelope of the building is properly weathertight and waterproof, and that the property is going to remain as good security for the lender and a suitable investment from the purchaser's point of view.
Well, let's go and see some of those hidden horrors I think you're going to show us, aren't you?
Yes, that's right, Gemma. And normally when I begin my survey, I'll be starting on the outside of the building, beginning at the roof and the main chimney stack in order to see what condition those parts are in.
So, Richard, let's start with the highest point, the chimney. Now, that one looks in pretty good condition to me, but I imagine there's all sorts of problems that can go wrong there.
Yes, I think the chimney is probably one of the most exposed parts of the property, and care's got to be taken to make sure that the pointing of the brickwork is in good order to prevent damp penetration. Your chimney stack might actually be rendered, in which case the render needs to be sound, no significant cracks or badly blown. Frequently we see plant growth coming out of chimney stacks, which is obviously a no-no, and needless to say you can get birds' nests and other debris. Television aerials can be secured to the stack. Those can sometimes work loose and cause damage to the stack itself.
Okay, so get up there and make sure that the chimney's cleared. That's the main thing.
I think so, and obviously the pretty bits around the bottom where the lead flashings are located are also very important, because that's going to stop rainwater penetration coming through from the roof slopes directly into the stack itself.
So from the chimney, our natural progression is onto the roof.
The main roof of the house, this is really the umbrella of the whole property, and it's essential that this is properly weathertight and maintains a good weatherproof covering over the building as a whole. I think it's probably fair to say that if your roof is in a poor state of repair, it would be unrealistic to get homeowners to completely renew the whole roof covering, because that's fairly expensive. Having said that, it would probably be a very good idea to get an estimate so that you're prepared when the surveyor comes round and he sees that the roof is obviously defective. You can advise him that you've had quotations and the cost may not be near as much as the surveyor is imagining. This will obviously help quite considerably if you have to have any renegotiation later on in the sale process.
We've talked about the main roofs on the houses, but what about flat ones? What are the problems that can arise there?
Flat roofs tend to be a permanent nightmare. They only ever have a limited life expectancy, and so it's quite possible that during the course of your occupation you're going to have to strip it off and replace it. This is something which most surveyors are very aware of, but it doesn't alter the fact that there can be significant problems. If the mineralised felt that the roof may be created from starts to blister and split, that will result in direct rainwater penetration, which will then spread throughout underneath the felt work. That will manifest itself and not only in rot to the timbers, but also leaks through to the room below, which may be part of your accommodation, or it may simply be a garage. Either way, it's going to have to be attended to. This is something that a homeowner can very easily address themselves, or again, if they haven't got the money, it's quite possible for them to get an estimate so that they can advise the surveyor that yes, they're aware the flat roof is gone and this is the estimate and the cost of getting it renewed.
So if you can't upgrade the roof yourself, then do get an estimate ready to give to the surveyor. Moving on from the roof and the guttering. Now that seems a block drain, I should imagine, would be not particularly costly, but Richard, I understand that that can lead to much bigger problems if you don't attend to it.
I think it's probably fair to say that out of all of the properties I've looked at, guttering is one of the major issues which causes damp ingress into buildings and can subsequently cause damage to skirting boards, internal plaster, decorations and all the similar adjoining areas. Blocked gutters can be very easily and very cheaply cleared. If the downpipe happens to be cracked, or you've got old metal guttering which equally cracks and is often very difficult to repair because it corrodes, these are matters that you should really be thinking about addressing. If a surveyor is doing a survey on a property and he sees damp penetration or damp potential penetration as a result of a leak from guttering or a downpipe, he's going to follow the trail through and pick it up on the interior, where you could well find you've got some more serious problems.
Wow, so a blocked gutter you must attend to. It can lead to all sorts of problems, but you can catch it early, can't you? And then moving on from the guttering, and we have the windows, the window frames.
Yes, the main windows of a house obviously provide natural light and ventilation into the property itself. Many people these days have got plastic windows, which is great, normally double glazed. Make sure you've got a key there so that you can open the window and get out if the house is on fire. Having said that, the windows should be relatively easily maintained and the plastic can be cleaned down. If on the other hand that you've got box sliding sashes or casement windows, obviously ensure that those are in good order, that they're working. If they need decoration or if there's external wet rot, that needs to be addressed and painted. Again, it can all be done fairly cheaply, but if it's left alone, it's the sort of area where you can ultimately end up with further damage to the property, damp penetration, and obviously there are cost implications for a potential purchaser.
And this can knock extra pounds off your eventual sale price, can't it?
I think many of the items that we're trying to point out here on their own are regarded as relatively minor and easily addressed. But one of the big issues I found in doing surveys is at the end of the survey report, I can get together all of the various points that I've identified, and suddenly something that should have only been £500 put together can lead to expenditure of maybe £5,000 and a subsequent down valuation of the property.
Wow, you wouldn't have thought it, but that's an area where you can certainly lose serious amounts of money if you neglect it.
I think that's the case. If you have more significant problems like structural movement, well then that is obviously a completely different ball game and opens up a new can of worms.
Richard, on to our next potential defects.
I think you have to look at your walls fairly carefully. Walls are a very major item in doing a survey. You've got to appreciate that the walls are actually the bit that holds up the roof and holds the whole building together. Elevation walls can vary from being stone, brick, tile hung, rendered. There's a whole manner of different types of construction, and all of them have their own particular variations with regards to the defects that they have. Bear in mind their main purpose is to keep out the weather and the external rainwater, and from that point of view it's essential that pointing to brickwork is in good order, pointing to stonework is in good order. If your elevation walls are rendered, the rendered needs to be maintained as well as being put up there to start with, which means it's got to be decorated. If you've got excessive creeper growth which can work its way into windows, under eaves areas and into gutters, that needs to be clipped back to ensure that it's kept well and truly under control. Serious cracking is an area where you probably need to get more specialist advice. Damp penetration through the wall from leaking guttering, from rainwater, will give rise to internal damp problems, and that will cause in turn damage to plaster, decorations, woodwork, etc.
So there's a lot to think about there, but some of the main points, Richard, just to recap, are?
I think it's absolutely essential that all homeowners make sure that the external envelope of their property is serving as a satisfactory, good, weatherproof and rainproof cover for the whole building and keeps the interior dry and secure to include the occupants and their possessions. Simple things that can be addressed in relation to things like rainwater goods, which are very often a problem, can, as I say, be very simply addressed and can often resolve big problems. If, as a homeowner, you look at the exterior of your property and you're of the view that your dwelling is in particularly poor condition and there's rather a lot there, then by all means call in expert advice who can perhaps give you some hints and direction as to where to go in resolving some of the main issues.
And they may look lovely in the summer, but clear some of those creepers just to see what's going on behind them.
I think that's right, and everybody loves a bit of greenery and a creeper growth coming over the house. It adds to its character, it makes it look attractive, but it can also give you some very serious problems with regards to ingress of damp, damage to the surface of the stonework or render, woodwork, etc.
Well, we've looked at a modern property and now an older property we're coming to here, and presumably a whole new set of problems, and I can actually see quite an obvious one down there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Gemma, but I think this is an example of lack of maintenance, whether the property was old or new. It's again a classic example of similar problems being experienced with the same type of structure found on all of them. Here we've got a downpipe where the shoe and the base of the downpipe, which should be ducted around into the gully, has quite obviously fallen away because the fixing is broken loose. There's no actual securing element there. Very easy to sort out, can easily be put back. In the meantime, water's coming down the downpipe, it's going to splash up against the base of the wall, and that in turn could give difficulties with internal damp problems. If we follow the downpipe up throughout its length, you can see the outside of the downpipe has actually got some marks on it, and at the top where it begins to gooseneck into the undersides of the guttering, there's further blackening in there. That's all indicative of a past leak. In turn, we can see that the wall has also been stained, indicating that water has been running down the wall itself. If a surveyor sees that, he's going to instantly think internally there could well be damp issues inside this property, and that is something that he's going to beam in on, and he's going to follow the trail. This is equally something that the vendor of the property and the homeowner could very easily have sorted out and prevented from happening, so that the staining wouldn't have got there to start with. Very easy to fix that. Anybody can do that. It's just a question of having the right fixing, and the problem can easily be resolved at minimal cost.
And you can get rid of that sort of black, looks a bit like mould, doesn't it?
The mould and the marking of the wall can very easily now be cleaned down with a fungicide. Once that's done, it will be killed off. Any repairs necessary to the wall can be attended to, and then it can be redecorated, and that maintains the integrity of the building, keeps it properly weatherproof and watertight. Okay, Gemma, we were talking about the plastic windows earlier. This is a classic example of a timber casement window where it has been poorly maintained. The upper parts are still reasonably intact, but the lower part of the window frame is completely rotten.
Yes.
Attempts have been made to fill it in, but in all honesty, this window has now reached the end of its natural useful life. It's had it, it's beyond sensible repair. It might be feasible to keep the frame, but in all honesty, this window is a softwood window. It probably doesn't warrant it. And we're looking at a cost implication, in addition to which attention will need to be undertaken to the reveals, both internally and externally. We'll have to pay for somebody to fit the window as well. So a simple repair or maintenance item that could have been done earlier on in the history of this particular window is now going to cost quite a bit of money. Either the purchaser is going to have to renegotiate the price accordingly in order to accommodate this sort of work, or alternatively the vendor is just going to have to take a hit, and it's a shame because it's unnecessary.
Okay, this looks like the classic kind of wall, which I'd think, actually, I'll leave that for the next person to worry about whilst I got on and sold the property. But you're going to tell me something else, aren't you, Richard?
Yeah, Gemma, you're absolutely right. This is a classic example of the sort of thing that a lot of homeowners would not bother attending to. What I can point out to you here is that we've got some creeper growth there, which has obviously been killed off in the past. It is beginning to reform again at the bottom, and that could ultimately cause damp issues, particularly lower down on the wall. Higher up, we can see that there's a lot of mould growth over the surface, and really this wall needs to be cleaned down with a fungicide. The ivy growth or the creeper growth, whatever it is, needs to be killed off and removed and taken away. Elevation will redecorate it so it's all looking good and sound. This in itself is not a big problem and can be dealt with relatively cheaply, but it's going to take somebody with a tower scaffold. It's going to take a few man hours to sort it out, and when you start putting simple things like this together with other issues that we've identified, suddenly the cost of the works becomes a lot more expensive than you might otherwise think. The vendor's going to have to take a hit on it, and the purchaser is going to come back and say, well fine, I still want to buy the property, but I want to look at a renegotiation to cover the cost of these works. Okay, Gemma, we were talking about walls earlier on, and one of the things that can be of concern to surveyors is creeper growth that's over the elevation wall. It looks very pretty, but it's not always as straightforward as that.
I know, well, I can see up there, even I can tell that that needs pruning back. Seems to be introducing itself right into the bedroom there.
On a property like this, yeah, we have got a problem with the wisteria. In this particular instance, it's getting into the guttering, it's working its way underneath the tiled roof surface, getting into the roof space itself. As you can see, one of the sections has come across to the box sash window there, and it's actually worked its way into the window itself, and is quite obviously now going to be a problem.
Bit of an intruder, that creeper, isn't it?
It's going to need cutting back. In itself, the creeper growth is very attractive, and it's part of the character of this property, and it's something that you'd want to retain, but it mustn't take over the house. And this is...
I'm glad you said that, because I thought you were going to say you're going to have to cut it down, and it looks so pretty. It must be a bit of a selling point. So you can keep them, just clip it back.
There's nothing wrong with the creeper growth there. It's great, but when it becomes a bit of a triffid, you've really got to do something about it.
Okay, get out the pinking shears.
I think this one needs a good cutting back. It is a wisteria, so you've got to be careful as to what time of the year you do it if you want it to properly flower again afterwards. But, you know, there does come a point where something's going to have to be done. Okay, Gemma, round the corner here we've got a classic example of a brick elevation wall. This happens to be an outbuilding, but this could just easily be your own house. It demonstrates the problem perfectly. The pointing to this elevation wall has long since parted. Originally the pointing would have been like this, and as you can see, fairly even with the surface of the brickwork itself, but in actual fact it's badly weathered away. So much so that the top part of the gable is now beginning to lean in, although that's probably also to do with failure of some of the internal timbers. All the way down the elevation we can see that the rainwater has washed and weathered away all of the pointing, exposing more and more pointing. If this is your house and an elevation on your property, the surveyor is going to look at this and think, right, A, I'm going to have a really big damp problem inside, and secondly, the elevation wall is obviously in need of repointing. Some of this will need to be raked out and then refilled accordingly. Labour intensive work, not necessarily arduous work, but it's going to take a while to do it and it's going to be expensive. But if this is happening to the pointing on the external elevation of your wall, or indeed a chimney stack where it can equally occur, damp will be permeating into your property, down through the chimney stack, through the elevation wall, and the surveyor will see this and be looking to identify problems on the interior of the building, which sure as eggs are going to be there.
Richard, something else going on here, but I'm not entirely sure what this is. I haven't seen this before.
No, very often on a property you'll see that bricks are actually spalling, which means the surface is becoming very loose and friable and falling away. This is slightly unusual. These bricks actually have not been baked properly, and the resultant damage we're seeing here is purely due to frost damage.
Right.
This is arguably not a big problem. It's going to keep occurring. The best thing you can do is try and protect this brickwork as best as possible. Again, as you can see, the paintwork is lifting away. It wouldn't be very difficult for the homeowner here to clean down the wall, possibly with a needle gun, but clean down the wall, seal the surface in order to protect the brickwork as much as possible and give it a coat of paint. It's all very reachable, won't cost very much money. A little bit of minor making good to some of the pointing would also help. The problem is here that the surveyor is going to look at this in conjunction with the other defects that he's finding at the property, and suddenly something that was going to be fairly cheap and simple to sort out is now beginning to become a bit of a problem. His client is going to want to renegotiate. The vendor's not going to be happy because the values of property is going to be downvalued accordingly, and all for the sake of something which is probably fairly simplistic and could have been dealt with at the outset at a lot lesser cost.
Totally different situation here, a modern property, but what about the pointing?
Pointing on this property is absolutely fine. You can see that the face of the brickwork itself is all in good condition. This dwelling is probably no more than about 15 years old, and this is how the pointing should look on your house. If the pointing is deteriorated from this is the sort of thing that surveyor's going to pick up on, because it's ultimately going to give rise to internal damp problems.
Excellent, no problems here.
This is great.
Richard, you've talked a lot about how keeping the external decoration of the property shipshape is important, but is this cosmetic? Is this going to make a big impact on the value?
This is largely cosmetic. There will be some wet rot hidden in there. This case is probably rather extreme, and you can see that the paintwork here is lifting and blistering away, and ultimately there will be some rot present, particularly to the lower parts of the windows. This is a situation where homeowners really ought to maintain their properties by means of a planned maintenance programme if they can, so it doesn't get to this extreme. Here we're obviously going to have to undertake work to the guttering as well, because that's dirty underneath. It's going to need cleaning down, and indeed over there we can see that the guttering itself is completely blocked, and that will render it totally defective and needs attention. This gem is another example of the window that's deteriorated due to lack of maintenance. The bottom part of it is completely rotten. It's probably beyond any sensible repair now, and the whole of this window is best replaced given the overall condition of the remaining woodwork that's surrounding it.
You can certainly see it's very rotten. And what about this pipe coming out of the wall and going into the drain?
Yeah, the pipe is a standard pipe. Most people will have this on their house. It's serving the waste from the kitchen sink. You can see that where the pipe is exiting the wall, it's probably coming out a little bit too far proud from the wall surface. The opening needs stopping up to make sure no mice or other rodents can get into the building, and there's no proper clip at the bottom to secure the pipe to the elevation wall itself.
Okay. Richard, let's talk a little bit about boundary walls and fences, because it's not just about the property, is it? I think if I was a seller, I would be a bit confused as to whether I should upkeep this or I'll pass it on to the purchaser.
Yeah, this is a classic example, Gemma. This is a boundary wall. It's also a retaining wall, and you can see that it's quite clearly moved. It's been infilled in the past, but it's obviously moved again. I think from a surveyor's point of view, we'd be looking at this and thinking this could actually be potentially a very expensive repair if the whole boundary wall needs to be demolished and reconstructed. However, if the wall is stabilised, as I believe it probably has in this instance, this crack could then be re-raked out, repaired and decorated accordingly, so that when the surveyor is looking at your property, it's not going to become a big problem in terms of potential future expenditure. Exactly the same principle relates to boundary walls and fences. Where panels have broken, posts have rotted, if they get blown over in the wind, as they frequently do, simple repairs, routine maintenance works will not only make it look as it should do, but it'll also help to continue keep children and animals safe and sound.
So it's not just about carrying out repairs, it's also about preventative measures too, if you're looking to sell your property in the future.
I think it all forms part and parcel of the good routine maintenance of the whole household, and we're talking about the house, the garden, the walls, boundaries, the whole package.
Richard, let's go inside now and have a look at some of the problems that people are living with every day but might not notice need attending. So Richard, if you're selling your house, you need to take a trip up into the loft, and here we are. What are we looking for?
Okay, many homeowners don't go into the loft unless it's for storage purposes, in which case they're simply throwing in a suitcase or redundant Christmas tree decorations, the usual sort of things that we all have. What the surveyor will be looking for is to make sure that the void has been properly insulated, hopefully to a minimum depth of between 10 to 12 inches, that the cold water storage tank has been properly lagged and covered over. In this particular instance, that's not a proper lagging jacket, but it's performing reasonably well, and I would be happy with it. Pipework surrounding the tank should also be properly insulated, and any vertical elevation walls within the void that are forming stud work between the void itself and any internal rooms should also be properly insulated. Ideally, we'd also like to make sure that there's a degree of ventilation into the void. Very often on old properties that's not the case, but certainly on more modern properties, in order to comply with building regulation approvals, ventilation is one of the aspects which is now covered in a lot more detail than it used to be years ago.
And how do you get ventilation into the roof space if it's an old property?
If it's an old property, it's a lot harder. Very often you can do it around the eaves areas, but obviously then care's got to be taken to make sure that the eaves are not covered over with the insulation, thus preventing any through draft. Very often, if you've got a block built wall or indeed a stone wall, it would be feasible to punch a hole through it and put in an air brick to provide ventilation through to both sides of the void. But obviously you've got to consider the positioning of chimney stacks, chimney flues, etc. So it's not always necessarily that straightforward. The other aspect that we'd be looking at is to see whether or not the timbers within the void are suffering from any woodworm or beetle infestation. In this particular instance, we've got a classic example of woodworm where we've got holes, flight exit holes, and if you've got these in your property, then you really need to get in the experts so that they can treat all of your timbers accordingly. Under those circumstances, when the surveyor comes round, you'll be able to give him confirmation that the timbers have been treated and that hopefully you've got a certificate with a 25-year guarantee. That way the purchaser will be happy, the building society will be happy, the surveyor will be happy, and on the assumption that the timbers have not been completely eaten to pieces, the roof should stay intact for some time to come.
Okay, so don't put it off, you have to make a trip up into the loft.
It's got to be worthwhile doing because the surveyor's definitely going to go there.
They're going to go there, okay. Richard, we're in another roof space, but quite a different scenario going on here with these cold water tanks.
Yeah, Gemma, this is a classic example of a house where the cold water tanks have not been properly lagged or covered over. Not only will you get debris falling into the tanks itself, but the void has also not been adequately insulated. We've only got about 2 inches here. The void should be insulated to between 10 to 12 inches to comply with modern day building regulations. And in addition to that, 25% of the heat loss from a house is going to come straight out through your roof, and you're going to save dramatically on your heating bills. If the void can be insulated, you'd probably get your money back within the first 12 months.
Wow, so it's going to make it much cheaper all round if you just do some simple insulation.
A definite plus. Most homeowners can do it or get somebody to do it. It's something that the surveyor is going to be very hot on, particularly bearing in mind energy rating reports that are also prepared on houses as a result of recent EEC legislation.
This is an old house. A crack here doesn't seem unusual to me. They shift and move, don't they? Is this all just part of the character that we're looking at now?
Normally, yes. You'll notice that in this particular instance, the crack is right up against the wall, and this actually is not a crack in the ceiling. This is a result of damp permeating down through from a chimney stack on the outside that has not been properly maintained. Damp has permeated down through the stack. It's resulted here in coming out and showing itself at ceiling level. The plasterboard of the ceiling is now slightly dished, and if you look very closely you can actually see drip marks running down the wall in this location. There's every likelihood that the timbers immediately behind here are going to be suffering from wet rot, and it's something that the surveyor is going to be considering. In this particular location, I happen to be aware that this ceiling has been covered over with a stain block and the ceiling repainted in order to hide the stain that was there. But nonetheless, the telltale sign still remains, and I will pick up on this, and any surveyor would as well. The homeowner in this instance would have to take it to one stage further and do the necessary repair, as well as resolving the problem in relation to the chimney stack, so that the surveyor doesn't actually identify this as being a particularly nasty problem, and if it is, it's been sorted out.
Okay, so a fireplace for the home can be a real bonus, isn't it? But if you don't maintain it, presumably there's a whole load of pitfalls in there somewhere that people might stumble across.
Yes, Gemma, I think that there are an awful lot of problems that you can get with fireplaces and flues generally. I think the best advice that I'm able to give homeowners in the context of what we're doing today is to make sure that the flue is being properly cleaned through, swept, and that it's being done so regularly, because that's a question that the surveyor is likely to ask. If you happen to have a wood-burning stove or multi-fuel stove similar to this one, then it's essential to know that the flue has been properly lined, because the wood-burning stove is going to burn at a much higher temperature than a normal open fireplace, and if it hasn't been lined, there is the risk of a chimney fire.
Okay. Richard, something that fills most people with horror is damp. There's lots of different types of it. How do we deal with it?
Okay, damp breaks down basically into 5 different areas. We've got rising damp, penetrating damp, condensation, leaks because there's a hole in the roof, or leaks because you've got defective plumbing. It so happens in this particular room we've got a very good example of rising damp, and in this instance it's also adversely affected the skirting, because the skirting can be seen to be completely rotten, and that actually goes round the corner into this corner of the building where the wall above, the plaster's obviously damaged, rising damp is coming through.
Okay, so rising damp, that's always going to be around the skirting board.
Tends to be at low level in the building, not normally above around 1 metre in height, usually up to a maximum of 1.4, because rising damp won't tend to come up higher than that, unless of course you've got a mound of earth on the outside of the building, in which case yes, it could be coming up higher. So if you've got big flower beds around your house, make sure that the height of the soil is well below the correct level, and it's not bridging the damp-proof course if indeed you have one.
Okay, and we've got something else that looks fairly ugly over your shoulder.
Yes,
there.
this is interesting because you can tell that there's no damp on the lower section, there's no damp on the upper section. That's actually the outside wall, so it's not penetrating, which means this has got to be attributable to condensation. And I strongly suspect that at some stage in this location there was some form of dresser unit, stale air had built up to the rear of the dresser's been taken away, and there is the resultant black spot mould purely down to condensation. That will easily be sorted out, but obviously the property is going to need refurbishing and attention. Condensation like that can occur quite frequently, quite easily. Condensation is a man-made problem. Imbalance between heating and ventilation, so it's essential that you keep your property properly ventilated and properly heated at all times.
Okay, so that's rising damp, condensation type of damp. Shall we look at the third kind of damp?
Okay, Gemma, this is one of the other types of damp. This is penetrating damp, where damp has penetrated directly through the external elevation wall. As you can see, the end result in here is quite dramatic. The plaster is all gone. It's badly gone up here. It's pouring out down here, and it's also damaged underneath the window. The window's recently been replaced with a plastic window. It's feasible that some of this damp may have been coming through a previous defective box sash window. This is also been aggravated not only by penetrating damp directly through the wall, but by our next type of damp, which is damp coming directly through as a result of a defective roof covering, or in this particular instance, defective guttering. Guttering has allowed the rainwater to run down the walls, and that's actually added to the problem of the penetrating damp. Again, if the guttering had been sorted out, the penetrating damp probably would never have occurred, and this rather extreme example of the end result is what happens, which is why when we're doing a survey on a property, we are particularly concerned about the condition of external rainwater goods and how it may affect the dwelling on the inside.
So when you showed us those plants perched in the guttering, which were making a new home for themselves, they really can cause all of this damage on the inside.
This is a direct result, and the surveyor is going to follow the trail. He sees that on the outside, he's going to have a pretty good idea as what he's going to find on the inside. Any homeowner can easily sort that problem out to prevent this ever reaching this sort of stage.
And what's our fifth and final type of damp?
The fifth and final damp is principally in relation to leaks as a result of defective internal plumbing.
And I bet you have an example to show us.
It's a little one.
Okay. Richard, there is a reason why you're in the bath, isn't there?
There certainly is, Gemma. Basically what we can see here from the position of in the bath, the copper pipework down here is badly corroded, and over a matter of time this will ultimately result in a direct leak. It happens to be at a ground floor level, but this could equally be upstairs. The reason for the corrosion, there could be various reasons for it, but leaking pipework is our final source really of leaks and damp problems within houses. Particular note is below shower areas where the shower tray is flexed and the water is running down the exterior of the waste pipe, resulting in damp to the ceilings, and that's a very common area. Homeowners should keep a careful eye on that at all stages so that they can see whether or not they're getting a problem with their internal plumbing and bathroom fittings.
So that's when someone gets in the shower and their weight makes the tray dip, the leaks happens, they get out again, and they don't know why there's been a leak.
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
And springing back into place means that when you then turn on the shower, trying to find the leak, because it's effectively sealed itself again by you stepping out, it's very difficult to trace the leak.
Okay, Richard, our 5 damp problems off the top of your head, just to recap.
Okay, the surveyor is going to be looking for rising damp, penetrating damp, condensation, damp as a result of leaks directly through the roof or possibly defective guttering, as well as leaks in association with your plumbing, be it heating or to do with your sanitary ware.
Okay, now it's time for you to get out of the bath, Richard. We've looked at the main structure of the house and the defects that can rise there, but what else is there that a surveyor might be looking for?
Okay, at the outset I mentioned that we'd be looking at doing a detailed inspection of the exterior, the interior and the services, and the services largely covers points such as electricity, gas, central heating and water supplies. These are all regarded as specialist, and it's not something that the surveyor is necessarily going to be going into great detail on, but he will be commenting and advising his clients in respect of the state of the possible overall repair. To that extent, it'd be worthwhile homeowners making sure that the boiler has been regularly serviced, because the surveyor is likely to ask if that's been done. Equally, if your electrical circuits are of a reasonable quality, have they recently been certified and is a certificate available? If the circuits are very obviously old, the surveyor is going to raise a question with regards to the lack of independent circuit breakers as opposed to the old slot fuses that may be there at the moment, and those are aspects which the surveyor will report back. If it's consequent of that is that the property is going to need rewiring, then there could be expenditure of £3,000 to £5,000. If you've got a cold water storage supply, assuming you're not on a private system, then is that supply properly metered? Where's your stop tap? Where's the internal stop tap? Have there been any problems with it? And that in turn will link to the cold water storage tanks up in the roof space, where we've already seen that they've either not been properly lagged or they have been adequately lagged and insulated. And it will be the surveyor following on through and commenting accordingly, so that the purchaser of the house is aware as to A, where they are, and arguably, are they likely to need any significant attention, or have they been properly maintained?
In the past, we've heard some pretty terrible horror stories about carbon monoxide poisoning to do with the flues and where they're positioned. What will you be looking at as a surveyor when it comes to a boiler?
Well, one of the reasons why we'd ask the vendor as to whether or not the boiler has been regularly serviced is to make sure that the boiler is in proper working order. But we will be looking at where the flue to the boiler exits from the building. Is the flue too close to a bedroom window, so that in theory fumes could be blown back in, and various other aspects about the boiler. Is there a smell of gas surrounding the boiler? Is there smell of heating oil if it's an oil-fired boiler? All of these points we will be looking at, but it is specialist equipment. There's a vast array of different types of boiler out there, and we just cannot carry the knowledge that's necessary in order to give full-blown advice about that aspect, but we are able to give hopefully some sensible pointers as to the overall condition of the system. Hopefully most homeowners will have their boilers fairly regularly checked over and regularly serviced, and therefore minimising the chance of us necessarily identifying a major problem in that area.
Richard, we're not interested in the pot, but what's underneath it, and what many of us might not even really think about is the drainage and what we have to do to prepare that for sale.
Gemma, drains are the one area of the property that people least bother to look at. If you know there's been a problem and your drains have been recently blocked, it would pay to make sure that they're thoroughly cleaned and flushed through, so that when the surveyor raises them, he sees that there isn't an instant difficulty there. If there is a blockage in the drains, it could be due to the materials that the drains are made out of, it could be due to nearby building works, or it could be due to tree growth and a variety of other reasons. So assuming that the chamber itself is free from blockage, the surveyor is probably going to be fairly happy. The other aspect to bear in mind is to make sure you know where your manhole covers are, because the surveyor is going to ask you so that he can lift them and carry out the inspection necessary.
Now Richard, I think most people would think the survey was just about the property, but it's actually also about what's in your garden, the outbuildings and the garages. And some garages may be more than what they seem.
Yes, Gemma, that's right. I think that you've got to remember that the garage and outbuildings is going to need the same sort of maintenance as the main property. Obviously you don't have to go to the same degree because the garage is not being used for the same intensive purpose. However, not all garages or outbuildings are maybe what they seem on the outside. Very often people convert the garages to provide for granny annexes, accommodation for teenagers, office use, and you've got to be careful that under those circumstances you've got the relevant consents, because if the surveyor is going to look at those aspects, he's going to be raising the question.
Another example of an outbuilding, but this one looks really far gone, and to repair it looks really costly. I'd be quite worried about this.
Yeah, I think you'd be quite right to be worried about it. In actual fact, this outbuilding's been here for quite a long time and it's quite savable. Originally the end there was glazed, it's been replaced with some plastic. Plastic's gone brittle in the sun. The original bars between the panes have now rotted out, but without an awful lot of money this could be attended to. There's not, believe it or not, a great deal of rot there, and so this gable end could quite easily be saved, rebuilt and decorated over with some protective preservative on the wood, and the outbuilding should remain fine for some time to come. Unfortunately, a purchaser will look at that and think money, a surveyor will look at that and think exactly the same thing. A vendor could perhaps have sorted this out for probably not a vast amount of money and would have saved themselves some money down valuing, renegotiating, etc. This is a classic case where, again, put together with other items, we're starting to look at big money.
Well, we hope this video has helped give you some understanding of the type of defects a surveyor is looking for. Identifying those same defects in your own home and carrying out basic repairs can really help save you money, and Richard, it can also help with the sale process.
I think that's right, Gemma, and I'd like to think that although people's style of house and construction varies across the whole country, we've tried to concentrate on those defects which are common to all properties, and ones which vendors can probably fairly easily correct, if not themselves, by a local handyman. And under those circumstances, that's going to help the survey and the valuation process go through to a satisfactory conclusion for all parties.
We hope so. Richard, thank you very much for your expert advice, and to you, good luck with your sale.
Good luck.